Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Thomas Heinutzi. I'm an advisor of Mayors for Peace and a retired Austrian disarmament, a diplomat, and I have the pleasure to lead you through this webinar. I think it's very topical these days. It's a nuclear deterrence. Does it guarantee security, or is it rather a threat to our security? And three organizations are co-sponsoring this event. And we will start with a short message from the president of Mayors for Peace, Mayor Matsui from Hiroshima.
Good evening, everyone. 平和首長会議会長を務めている広島市長の松井和美です。平和首長会議ヨーロッパ支部 ICAN および IDN の共催により、核抑止力をテーマとするウェビナーが開催されるにあたり、一言ご挨拶を申し上げます。現下の国際情勢は、ロシアによるウクライナ侵攻は長期化し、中東情勢が悪化するなど混迷を極めている中で、我々が核兵器は断じて使ってはいけない兵器であると訴え続けてきたにもかかわらず、他国より優位に立ち続けるための核戦力を含む軍拡競争が続いています。このまま世論においても武力に頼らざるを得ないという考えが強まっていけば、平和な世界の実現は遠のくばかりです。このような状況だからこそ、私たちは市民の安心安全な生活を守る使命を担う自治体の首長で構成する組織として、対話による平和的解決に向けて各国の為政者の行動変容を促すための平和文化を市民社会に広めていかなければなりません。本日ご参加の皆様には、世界の8400を超える平和都市ネットワークへ発展した平和首長会議とともに核兵器の廃絶とその先にある世界恒久平和の実現に向け、共に力を尽くし行動してくださることを心から期待しています。終わりに、本ウェビナーのご成功とご参加の皆様の今後ますますのご健勝とご多幸を心より祈念いたしまして、私の挨拶とさせていただきます。Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mayor Matsui. And then I would invite Daniel Höxter, the Deputy Director of ICAN, to say a few words to us. Daniel?
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm very happy that we could work with Mayors for Peace, the Mayors for Peace European chapter and IDN on this really important event, perhaps the crucial topic and challenge facing us as advocates in all our different ways for nuclear disarmament. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all the speakers we have with us today, all of whom have contributed hugely to this field and whom we and ICAN learn from constantly. For ICAN, changing the perception of nuclear weapons must always start with awareness of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, always placing them at the center of all discussions and in all forums, and also ensuring that the voices of those who are what we feel the true experts about nuclear weapons, that being the survivors, the hibakusha, and those affected by nuclear weapons testing, are heard and heeded. And in so doing, we'll challenge and dismantle the false notion of security offered by nuclear deterrence, and challenge and change the policies of all the governments that are complicit in promoting nuclear weapons as a legitimate source of national security. We're so thrilled that in a few weeks, or in a couple of weeks, I should say, Nihon Hidankyo will be accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. Their achievements and efforts to spread awareness around the reality of nuclear weapons are immense and highly deserving of this honor. And Terumi Tanaka from Nihon Hidankyo said in 2014 at the second humanitarian conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, he said, in order for humanity to survive, nuclear weapons must never be used. The quote, nuclear deterrence policy, which assumes the use of nuclear weapons, is a clear violation of the morality for human community to survive. We're also really excited in ICANN that states parties to the TPNW are taking on efforts to consider their security concerns and how they perceive the threat of nuclear weapons and the theory of nuclear deterrence. The second meeting of states parties established an intersessional consultative process, which will submit a report to the third meeting of states parties next year, containing a comprehensive set of arguments and recommendations. And the aims are to challenge the security paradigm based on nuclear deterrence by highlighting and promoting new scientific evidence about the humanitarian consequences and the risks of nuclear weapons, and juxtaposing this with the risks and assumptions that are inherent in nuclear deterrence. As I said, Nihon Hidankyo will be delivering the Nobel Peace Prize lecture on December 10th, and we have no doubt that this will be the call to action that kicks off the 80th anniversary commemorations. But in order to be effective advocates, we have to also learn and have the best arguments, which again is why I'm so excited to hear from the speakers we have with us today. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being here and pass back to Thomas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Now I would like to invite Marc Finot, the Vice President of IDN, Initiative pour le Désarmement Nucléaire, to address it briefly. I know, Marc, you had some issues in connecting. Are you on?
Thomas, I don't think he's on.
Okay. So sorry, we have to skip this and send our best greetings to our friend Marc. And now we will start with the panelists. And the first one will be Dr. Francesca Giovannini from Harvard. Francesca is the Executive Director of the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Francesca, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and good morning from Boston, everyone. Let me thank again ICANN and the Mayors for Peace for this invitation. I'm joining in a day of Thanksgiving for the United States, as a day where we gather with our families to give thanks and to reflect a little bit on this past year. And I want to start with that one just by putting a few reflections on the table. This has been a terrible year. Last year has also been terrible. And I think it is very obvious that what we are witnessing all over is a resurgence in the belief of hard power. It's not necessarily only nuclear weapons. It is the belief that fundamentally you can punch somebody in the face, that you can display project powers, and you will somehow win the day. And there has been overall, in my view, a very clear dismissal increasingly of diplomacy and of negotiations as appeasement. And so this is where we start today. We convene today in a moment in time where making arguments about nuclear disarmament are extraordinarily complicated. But let me also mention from the nuclear deterrence side, the nuclear deterrence also has a very high, steep ladder to climb. And I would like somehow to put on the table a few provocative thoughts, precisely because of the moment in time in which we are convening. Now, I want to actually start with the title of the webinar that says and asks us to reflect on whether nuclear deterrence is a guarantee of or a threat to our security. And I would argue that, well, from a nuclear deterrence standpoint, the guarantee and the threat come hand in hand. You threat in order to guarantee, right? And so you will not necessarily be able to distinguish the two, because nuclear deterrence is fundamentally based on threats, is based on manipulation of risks, is based on creating fear in the mind of the adversary. And in that way, you obtain not peace. Nuclear deterrence is not about peace, but it is about a limited amount of security and predictability. And I want you to remember this, because nuclear deterrence has never argued that this mechanism will create world peace, as just stated that given the circumstances, what we can possibly assure is a limited amount of security and predictability. That is the best we can do, right? And so depending on what side of the equation you sit in, whether you believe that human nature is fundamentally good and can coexist peacefully and cooperatively, or whether you believe that fundamentally what you're seeing around the world is in fact, what human nature is, then you actually judge nuclear deterrence based on that consideration. But let me make just 3 brief points about nuclear deterrence that I would like to engage in the Q&A. First of all, let me say that deterrence overall is just a fact of life. It is a fact of human nature interaction. If you look at kids, how they play, a kid to another kid says, if you touch my toy, I'm going to punch you in the face. This is deterrence, right? So deterrence has always been around for as long as human nature and interactions has existed. But I think what we are discussing today is a type of deterrence, which is nuclear deterrence, is relying on the use and on the threat of use of nuclear weapons in order to change the mind of adversaries. And there I gave a couple of thoughts. For me, nuclear deterrence today is fundamentally inescapable. We have tried to escape nuclear deterrence for a long time. In fact, the arrival on scene of nuclear weapons did generate 2 types of schools of thoughts. The first one that emerged immediately was a nuclear disarmament school of thought. It was the scientists that actually participated in the Los Alamos initiative. It was Oppenheimer, it was Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, everyone involved somehow in the bomb project that tried desperately to give an option beyond the bomb. That failed. Another was another school of thought that I think nuclear disarmament doesn't consider enough, which is instead the conventionalization of nuclear weapons. Is the belief that fundamentally nuclear weapons are weapons and can be used in war. The good part of what emerged in 1945 was a third way, not a perfect way, but the way that was somehow better, at least than the option of conventionalizing nuclear weapons, and that was nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence was not inevitable, and it was not predetermined. It was a school of thought that emerged out of other 2 schools of thought in 1945. And nuclear deterrence, in a way, for many who actually believe nuclear deterrence, is in a way the best option we've got. Conventionalizing nuclear weapons, I let you imagine what it means, fighting with nuclear weapons, is one option. And the other one is nuclear disarmament. Nuclear deterrence stands in between the 2 and says, look, we live in a world with nuclear weapons. The use should be reduced or mitigated the risk at any possible point, but security at this point in time can rely on the existence of these nuclear weapons. And again, let me mention that the question of nuclear disarmament should not only be addressed to nuclear deterrence, it should also be addressed to a community that does believe that nuclear weapons are simple weapons and they have to be integrated in conventional strategies. The second issue about nuclear deterrence is that it's intangible, right? We talk about manipulation of risks. You actually don't see that game. You're seeing it a little bit in the threats that Putin, for example, releases. But when we talk about the consequences of the failure of nuclear deterrence, nobody actually understands exactly what we mean. That's why I think the humanitarian campaign was particularly important and powerful, because it did allow us to really consider the consequences of the failure of the system, right? But normally when you are in nuclear deterrence argument, everything is hypothetical, everything is sanitized, right? And so you talk about this manipulation of risks, this game, these strategic moves, but you don't actually understand exactly what it means, how the world would look like if nuclear deterrence would somehow fail. Let me just make 2 more points. I think nuclear deterrence is partially untestable. You either believe in nuclear deterrence or you don't, in a way. But I would also disagree with people that say we don't actually have proof that nuclear deterrence is working or not working. We know, for example, what the world was before the arrival of nuclear weapons. We have plenty of huge wars, long wars, terrible wars. Then nuclear weapons arrive. But the problem, in my view, with nuclear deterrence arguments today is that we tend to overplay the role of nuclear weapons. I think John Mueller in The Banality of Nuclear Weapons is absolutely right, that we have somehow ascribed to nuclear deterrence magical powers that we actually no way to test, right? So arguing that Europe has not somehow met a long war after 1945 because nuclear weapons were around, I think is an oversimplification, right? So I think nuclear deterrence scholars that have more reasonable, in my view, positions argue that, look, nuclear weapons have played a role, but not the fundamental role. It's part of an equation of factors that have somehow prevented a conflict among great powers. And I want you to remember this, nuclear deterrence is not about peace. It's not about hot peace or cooperation or engagement. It is about preventing a minimum level of conflict among great powers. So that is the promise of nuclear deterrence. And then in my view, and I finish with this, and I know you will take a lot of issues with this. To me, right now, nuclear deterrence is fundamentally inevitable and unstoppable. I just don't know how you would convince countries that truly have seen the destruction, the aberration, the aberration of the Russian war on Ukraine, the potential escalations in the Middle East, to convince countries that can get nuclear weapons to avoid them. What kind of credible defense would these countries get in this world, not in a world that we want to build, but in this world today, to actually build their own security? I think this is a question we need to reflect on. And I just don't think that the argument of nuclear disarmament in this context today actually has developed enough to convince countries that this is the way to go. I finish with this. However, I think there is a real chance to make an interesting intellectual effort to understand the real limitations of nuclear deterrence. Not in order to convince countries that nuclear disarmament is the way to go, but to actually grasp with the limitations of the current system. And I give you two in particular. I think it is very true that nuclear deterrence has demonstrated very clearly in the Ukraine war in particular that deterrence is not a political solution. The nuclear deterrence is not meant to be somehow, stretch and stretch and stretch, and it will remain and continue to exist. So nuclear deterrence is supposed to open a space on which you build on for engagement. But if you rely only on nuclear deterrence is just not to give you anything in the sense of building a future, right? The second important thing is nuclear deterrence is mostly about countries that have nuclear weapons. And this is where I think the TPNW and the humanitarian campaign have done really important work. Nuclear deterrence doesn't care about collective security. Nuclear deterrence cares about the security of countries that have nuclear weapons. And what they are saying to the rest of the world is, as long as we don't fight with each other, the system will remain in a sort of balance. It doesn't mean that the system will be peaceful, but it means that at least you will prevent these large conflicts among great powers that have actually had really terrible repercussions on the international system. I finish with this. I think there has been a distortion in how we talk about nuclear deterrence. And that's why when I teach the military in particular, and when I teach my students, I go back to the theories of nuclear deterrence of the 50s and the 60s. Nuclear deterrence is not supposed to do everything. Nuclear deterrence is not about peace building. It's not about cooperation building. It's none of this. It's not about collective security. Nuclear deterrence is about preventing a major conflict among great powers that hold these terrible weapons. So nuclear weapons have a very limited role in the international system, right? Because the more we ascribe nuclear weapons a larger role in stability, in defense, and so on and so forth, and the more, in my view, we really get away from the original thinking behind nuclear deterrence. And so again, yes, a very limited application, but an application that to me is quite important in the current moment in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I think you really offered us a lot of food for further discussion. Thank you. That was very useful, especially for a start. And now we would like to listen to Dr. Benoit Pelopidas, who is Professor of Security Studies and the founder of the Nuclear Knowledge Program at Sciences Po in Paris. Benoit, please talk to us.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you all for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to address an audience of elected officials. I want to, and also I have to say, to be in the company of old friends and people I've read and cited and taught for a long time. What I want to focus on here is really reassessing nuclear deterrence in light of what makes the team distinct. So what makes the Nuclear Knowledges Program different is that, contrary to most entities that produce knowledge about nuclear weapons realities, we refuse any funding that carries conflicts of interest. And thanks to that, in a piece written with Schelling, we managed to objectify the fact that the knowledge production about nuclear weapons suffers from a problem of bias derived from its funding structure. So once we know that, I think we need to ask ourselves, what does the reliance on nuclear weapons do? And that's what I'm going to focus on in those like 10 minutes. So we know that nuclear deterrence, for instance, is no protection, right, against all state threats. Nuclear deterrence is acknowledging a form of vulnerability and hoping that this vulnerability will convince the other party to not attack. But it puts you at the mercy of accidental or inadvertent explosions, or at the mercy of any adversary that would simply be willing to take that risk. So the first thing is, as Francesca tried to undo false assumptions about what nuclear deterrence is and isn't, it's not protection. And there are a series of effects of reliance on nuclear deterrence that I will simply not talk about today, but I just want to gesture towards them because we sometimes overlook them. One of them is an effect on democracy. And that's one of the findings of the team, that literally the production of nuclear weapons and the production of nuclear weapons acquisition has led to the creation of pockets of nuclear secrecy and has decreased accountability for nuclear weapons related policies. That's the PhD dissertation of Thomas Fraisse. Others have shown, and I'm sure colleagues will talk more about that, that leaders of nuclear-armed states in several circumstances, and long before that happened to the Russian case in 2022, have felt emboldened by the possession of nuclear weapons. So it's not just, enabling a form of security, it's also enabling a form of aggression. But here I want to focus on three particular effects because they counter common parlance about nuclear weapons. The first one simply is that when we talk about relying on nuclear weapons for security so far, or possibly in the future, with all nuclear weapon states modernizing their arsenals, we talk about it as if relying on those weapons is relying on perfect control over them. And we now have clear evidence from the work I did, but also other people did, like I'm thinking Ned Lebeau, I'm thinking Marta Sherwin, and several others, that in particular instances in the history of the nuclear age, what avoided unwanted nuclear explosions is not practices of control. It's what we call good luck, meaning a form of disobedience. It's thanks to disobedience that we've avoided explosions. It's thanks to technological failures that we've avoided explosions. It's thanks to parameters beyond control practices, such as the strength and direction of the wind in particular instances. So there is a fallacy in attributing to deterrence success the successes of luck. We need to be able to distinguish the cases in which we've avoided explosions thanks to luck and the cases in which we've avoided explosions thanks to the success of nuclear deterrence. And my point here is that we have documented tens of cases of luck, but it's very likely that our estimation is still an underestimation. But we do not know by how much we underestimate the role of luck. And this is mostly because of the absence of transparency of most nuclear weapon states. So lucky cases are not known in most nuclear weapon states. Most of the ones that we talk about are from the US, the UK, and possibly one from France, simply because most other nuclear weapon states are more opaque about their past. And we also need to remember that even in the most transparent nuclear weapon states, we're blind to the last 3 to 5 decades because of national security secrecy and nuclear secrecy. keep in mind that even for the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most studied crisis of the whole nuclear age, it took us over 3 decades to discover that luck was necessary to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions. So overall, if one thinks that the assessment we have now of the role of luck is complete, that would be tantamount to saying there are tens of cases of luck in only 2 countries, and there would have been none, not a single one, in all the others in the past, or in all the nuclear weapon states in the last 3 decades. So again, we rely on luck. We rely on luck probably more than we think, but we don't know by how much more we rely on it. Then the optimists in the room, if they're still with us, could say, yeah, but that's all old news, Benoit. Now it's so much better. So let me give you a series of reasons for why current nuclear deterrence policy still relies on luck. First, the proposals to automate command and control to make sure that your retaliatory strike and therefore your deterrence policy is credible. That is a deliberate loss of control. So deliberate wager on luck. Because overall, a lower dependence on luck would require verifiable evidence of progress of weapon safety and security in all nuclear weapon states. And we've documented that the guardians of the arsenals have every reason to not acknowledge cases of luck and to recast them as cases of control. Third reason, if the guardians of nuclear weapons today started to believe that they're perfectly controlled, they would become complacent. That would be a source of risk in itself. It's what's called the Titanic effect. Then here, I've only told you about one type of reliance on luck. There are others. I've only talked to you about accidental or inadvertent explosions. There are other sources of reliance of luck that we haven't exhausted. And then, if you think about the efforts to avoid the hacking of command and control, they lead to increased complexity in command and control systems. And sociologists Charles Perrow and Joan Downer have established that making systems more complex and more tightly coupled create new avenues for unforeseeable but unavoidable disasters. And finally, for those of you who have listened to the commentary on the war in Ukraine, you probably will have noticed how widespread reliance on one particular mode of luck is. And that mode is what I've labeled fortuitous disobedience. It's those people who say, yeah, so if President Putin gives the order to use nuclear weapons, do not worry. Someone down the chain of command will disobey and will avoid the implementation of the order. That is a mode of luck because in a system in which everyone is trained to obey all the time, we bet on the fact that people will disobey always when we need them to, but only then. And that's reliance on luck. Now, much more quickly on the other 2 things I wanted to kind of reassess and recast. We often hear that nuclear deterrence is no use or non-emploi in French, or it's only a threat. You know, nuclear deterrence is threatening. The problem with that is that overall, all nuclear weapon states but South Africa have engaged in nuclear testing. And at the time, nuclear testing was justified as being necessary for nuclear deterrence. So it's not me telling you that it was necessary for nuclear deterrence. It's me telling you that if in the past the proponents of nuclear deterrence said it's in the name of deterrence that testing is conducted, then the proponents of nuclear deterrence and its effects today should be accountable for the effects of testing. And the problem is that nuclear weapon states then monopolize knowledge about the effects of tests and have surrounded it with secrecy. Again, this is the work of Thomas Fraisse on secrecy, and that's a work that you've probably seen already, the work of my friend and colleague Sébastien Philippe on nuclear testing in Polynesia, showing that only one French nuclear test, Centaur, on the 19th of July of 1974, contaminated 110,000 French Polynesians beyond the threshold that would have granted them right for compensation under the 2010 Morin law. And so that, the discovery of that was only possible thanks to independent research. That also gives you a sense that we do not yet have a complete sense of the effects of nuclear testing, but we can't treat deterrence as strict non-use or strict only threat. That's my second correction. And the third one is that we tend to often hear that overall, in all possible futures, you're better off with the nuclear weapons you have, even if you have a minimal arsenal, than without. And if you do horizon scanning, you can just see that this is not true. There are futures in which that's true. There are futures in which it's indifferent. And there are futures in which that's simply false. So in case of inadvertent or accidental launch in any arsenals in the world, having nuclear weapons on your own territory makes you primary targets. In particular, if your adversary is a state that has a policy that says we do nuclear deterrence, but we also do damage limitation should deterrence fail. Damage limitation then becomes destroying as many nuclear weapons as possible before their launch status. Therefore, if there is any inadvertent or accidental launch, again, you are a nuclear weapon state, you become a primary target. If nuclear weapons become hackable, they also become immediately undesirable. This is another possible future. And finally, we assume but do not know that transformations of the Earth system will only affect nuclear weapons in ways that are manageable by the existing infrastructures. This is a series of papers, one by Schelling and one by Sterre van Buren, Thomas Fraisse, and myself. So those are the ways in which we should not, when we think about nuclear deterrence, treat possession of nuclear weapons as necessarily beneficial in all possible futures. And with that, I will keep my mouth shut. I thank you for your attention. This is just a challenge with technology. I look forward to your question. This is actually the QR code I wanted to show you. This gives you access to all the publication of the team if you want to have a look. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benoit. That was really interesting. And now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Laura Considine. She is an associate professor in international policy at the University of Leeds and co-director of the Center for Global Security Challenges. Laura, we are listening to you.
Thank you. Just to say that I feel like my connection is a bit unstable, so I apologize if I glitch or I cut out a bit. Hopefully it will stay. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. Thank you to Mayors for Peace. I'm really pleased to be able to be here and be part of this panel and to hear from the other panelists who are all people I greatly admire. So my work is mainly work on how we think and how we speak about nuclear weapons and how this impacts on what we think of as possible or impossible in nuclear weapons politics. So I'm very interested in language, how we talk about nuclear weapons and the sorts of questions that we ask So for my time, I'd really like to engage with the very interesting set of questions that we were posed for today's panel. So we were asked first, is it realistic to base the security of a country on this theory of deterrence? The second question, is it possible to agree that the world has been spared a nuclear war since 1945 due to deterrence? And then the third question that was on the text was, could deterrence fail? And what would be the result of such a failure? So question one, is it realistic to base the security of a country on this theory? This question describes deterrence as a theory. And that is true in one way. And so one way to address this question would be to work through or critique the logic of theories of deterrence. But you can also think of deterrence as something that states do as a practice, and a practice that has important material impacts in the world. So we were asked if deterrence was realistic. What is the reality of deterrence? And the reality is that deterrence relies on the existence of over 12,000 nuclear weapons that are products of a vast military industrial complex of nuclear bases, of production, of transportation, and of stationing. And this also includes a history of testing over several decades that Benoit mentioned. So for those of you who may not know, nuclear states conducted over 2,000 nuclear tests worldwide, including over 500 atmospheric tests, with a total power equal to 29,000 Hiroshima bombs. Between the Trinity test and 1988, a nuclear weapon was detonated on average every 9.6 days. So to turn to question two briefly of, has the world been spared a nuclear war due to deterrence? Robert Jacobs, in his book, The Global Hibakusha, actually argues that the Cold War was characterized by the continuous use of nuclear weapons. That is ignored in the discussion of a lack of nuclear use since 1945. In fact, he describes the era for those impacted by these tests as that of limited nuclear war in the service of deterrence. Deterrence has, through that, created international communities whose homes were near testing and production sites, and who have then lived with transgenerational effects on their environment and health, including higher rates of cancers, miscarriages, infant mortality, food contamination, and mass displacement. Nuclear testing in the service of deterrence also requires a range of other contaminating practices that includes uranium mining and enrichment, plutonium processing, missile testing, all of which have turned parts of the world into what Rens van Munster has called kind of environmental waste zones. In an era of a climate crisis, this is also part of a larger environmental footprint of militarization. So for example, we don't actually have great figures because of the lack of transparency on military carbon, but was the military a state, it would be the fourth largest state emitter of carbon in the world. Nuclear weapons and deterrence have also been intertwined with long-standing processes of violent colonial extraction. For example, the first weapons were made by uranium mined by forced labor in the then Belgian Congo. The environmental impacts of production have been concentrated on indigenous lands and marginalized communities. So this is the reality of deterrence. So you can argue, and many do, that all of this, while bad, is not as bad as what needs to be avoided, which is the possibility of nuclear war, right? Nuclear catastrophe and perhaps even extinction. And that's the other reality that continuing to base security on nuclear weapons creates. There are political consequences because nothing else seems as bad as the possibility of nuclear war. And therefore, almost anything, all sorts of other harms can be justified and legitimated in preventing that possibility and comparing it to the nuclear war. So the failure of deterrence threatens something so awful that almost anything else can be justified in relation to avoiding its horror. So to return to the first question of whether or not it is realistic to base the security of a country on deterrence, I think we are now in a situation where we have brought so much danger into the world through nuclear weapons that it actually skews what we see as realistic and what and whose security can be ignored and sacrificed in the service of nuclear deterrence. Oh, my light's gone off, sorry. I have an automatic timer in the office on the light that goes off if there's no movement for half an hour. So my light goes off in the service of the environment. So basically, yeah, deterrence has skewed what we see as realistic and what we're willing to do in the service of preventing of the ultimate bad of nuclear war. So whether that is nuclear test victims, uranium miners, our environment, or our health, all this can and has been measured in relation to nuclear war. And in relation to nuclear war, it has often historically been considered as worth sacrificing. So to end my words with the last question of could deterrence fail and what would be the result of such a failure, the failure of deterrence would indeed be awful. In fact, it could be catastrophic. But the practice of deterrence in itself has its own consequences, even before it fails. And those consequences influence and limit how we are able to justify what security is and whose security matters. And I think it's worth adding those questions to the discussion as well. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. So you widened a little bit our perception, and I think that's really necessary today to put some more fundamental questions. Our fourth and final speaker now will be Dr. Kjølf Egeland, who is senior researcher at NORSA. It's a research institute in Norway focusing on global governance, climate change, and nuclear disarmament. Kjølf, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Thomas, and thank you so much to the organizers for having me. I'm going to make 2 broad points about the topic under discussion, and then perhaps add a few observations to some of the interventions made before me. So, point number 1. The question, does nuclear deterrence work, is, in my view, not a very meaningful question. In the most basic sense, to deter means to scare. The word deter is originally Latin and means to put off or frighten. In this very broad sense, the question, does nuclear deterrence work, is tantamount to asking, is it possible to scare someone with nuclear weapons? I think the banal answer to this silly question is yes, it's possible to scare people with nuclear weapons. But again, this is not a very interesting or meaningful question. The much more important question, the big challenge that's been with us since 1945, is whether it's a good idea to keep nuclear weapons around on an indefinite basis, to rely permanently on nuclear arms as instruments of statecraft, of coercion or influence or national security. For me, and indeed much more accomplished thinkers like Hans Morgenthau, I think the answer is probably no. As my colleague Campbell Craig likes to put it, the combination of nuclear arsenals and international anarchy, that is the absence of a world state, portends eventual disaster. It may not happen today, or in a year, or even in 100 years, but at some point, things might go horribly wrong, and we won't have a second chance. Now, have certain state leaders refrained from carrying out aggression or provocative acts for fear of provoking eventual nuclear escalation? In a word, deterrence. Have nuclear weapons sometimes promoted restraint? Quite possibly, I think so. But nuclear deterrence practices have also helped to bring about increased animosities and extremely dangerous episodes, some of which, as Benoit Pelopidas talked about, we needed sheer luck to get out of in one piece. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for me, is a very good example. The conflict was produced by nuclear deterrence practices. All involved believed themselves to be acting defensively and rationally and to be engaged in practices of deterrence. But the conflict was also arguably resolved in part by nuclear deterrence practices, in the sense that once the crisis began spiraling out of control, the respective heads of government of the United States and the Soviet Union were very eager to avoid escalation. But notice that I say the crisis was resolved arguably by nuclear deterrence practices in part. Another necessary part was, as again Benoit Pelopidas talked about, sheer luck, as the events on the ground, and as it happened, the events under the surface of the ocean, transpired outside the control of the top leaders. Yet, a lot of people have taken from the Cuban Missile Crisis the supposed lesson that the day was saved by nuclear deterrence. I think this is extremely misguided. And I want to give you another counterfactual as well. Let's imagine that the nuclear weapons, the Soviet nuclear weapons, had stayed put on Cuba. I think if this had happened, most so-called experts or nuclear analysts would today argue that the presence of those nuclear weapons explained why the United States didn't invade Cuba, why there wasn't a second Bay of Pigs. Okay, the second point that I want to make, the second broad point, is that there is no such thing as a theory of nuclear deterrence. There are many theories of nuclear deterrence that contradict one another on crucial points. And just to simplify things, I would argue that there are two broad theories or schools of thought in this area. One is associated with the notion of the nuclear revolution, the idea that nuclear weapons fundamentally transformed world politics, and thinkers such as Kenneth Waltz, Robert Jervis, and Pierre Gallois. These thinkers argued that nuclear deterrence is quite straightforward and simple, that even very small nuclear arsenals have very powerful deterrent effects, and that the mere existence of nuclear weapons is likely to produce extreme caution on the part of all involved. The risks are simply so great that those involved will go to significant lengths to avoid situations that could spiral out of control and lead to nuclear use. The other major theory or school of thought is founded on the idea that nuclear deterrence is not easy, but quite difficult to achieve. The balance of terror in this view is not straightforward, but delicate. This school of thought is associated with people like Herman Kahn and Robert and Roberto Wohlstetter. Now, these two respective theories are still quite vague and in many cases unfalsifiable in the scientific sense, but they are at least slightly less slippery than the banal claim that nuclear weapons are scary. For what it's worth, I think the war in Ukraine has given at least some ammunition to the second of the two schools of thought outlined above. I would say that the behavior we are seeing is not consistent with extreme caution or risk averseness. That being said, I think the nuclear shadow does affect what goes on in the war. It has, I think, affected the intensity and nature of outside support for Ukraine. So just to sum up this point, when Dr. Giovannini says that people either believe in nuclear deterrence or they don't, and I totally agree that this is how it often is. People do often claim to be believers or non-believers. Well, my question is, which nuclear deterrence theory do they believe in? This whole area seems to me to have a very strong religious or ideological connotation. For me, it seems much more plausible that nuclear deterrence produces its intended effects sometimes, maybe even most of the time, but not other times, and that it is always risky. So just to finish on Ukraine, which several of the speakers before me have touched on, I think just my overall takeaway, or the observation that strikes me the most, is that Ukraine has been able to defend itself quite well against the world's largest nuclear power, much better than anyone thought before February 2022. And then second, I'll just throw in a hopefully or potentially provocative hypothesis, which I've heard some people talk about, but that hasn't gotten so much attention. And that's the idea that NATO and EU members would have been able to do more for Ukraine had the US, UK, and France not possessed nuclear weapons. If we assume that as many do, that the reason the US, the UK, and France cannot intervene more forcefully on the side of Ukraine is that this would risk escalation to all-out nuclear war. We remember Biden talking about Armageddon. Well, taking away this possibility could, in theory, if we assume that Russia would only use nuclear weapons in existential circumstances for itself, and not to hold on to recently captured Ukrainian territory, then taking this off the table could actually allow the West to do more for Ukraine. So I thought I'd just end on that point, and also, of course, to reinforce that, as Dr. Giovannini said, the prospects for arms control and disarmament are pretty bleak at the moment. But we know, of course, that things can change very, very quickly in international politics. They did, for example, in the middle of the 1980s, and they could change again. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Well, thank you so much, Kjell. Very good thoughts, and I also liked how you phrased it, that nuclear deterrence might work sometimes, but not always, but it's always risky. I see that Marc Finot, who had a problem with his connection, has written to us, and he underlines how important this multi-stakeholder approach and partnership between civil society and researchers, cities, and governments is to challenge the new doctrine of nuclear deterrence that threatens the world's security. His organization, EDN, just published jointly with ICANN France a list of arguments, 20 lies on nuclear weapons and how to respond in French, and it will soon come out also in English. On the website, it's edn-france.org. So this should help activists. And with this, I want to finish and send my greetings and gratitude to Marc.
Thomas, Marc is here.
Oh, he can speak now because he sent us this message. Yeah, sorry, Marc, then I have already said most of the things you wanted to say. Do you want to add something?
Thank you very much, Thomas. And my apologies for this disruption. Of course, I didn't use the correct links. Yes, thank you. You said most of what my message was supposed to be. Of course, to thank the organizers to support this joint initiative, and to just remember to recall that over the last couple of decades, most progress in arms control and disarmament was the result of civil society initiatives. You know, the INF Treaty was really the result of the big demonstrations against the Euro missiles. And then we had, after the Cold War, of course, the so-called humanitarian disarmament, anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, arms trade treaty, and then finally the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. All this was the result of campaigns by NGOs that finally convinced states. Of course, this is always a privilege when NGOs can express themselves, can be active and benefit from this freedom. It's not always the case in some authoritarian regimes, but I think once these initiatives start, they get the ball rolling, and this can have a snowball effect. And some countries even when they are not so democratic, they can also be influenced by this. So this should be an encouragement to continue to challenge this theory of deterrence. And of course, the stellar panel that you gathered, worldwide, world-class experts play their very useful role in that. Of course, we also need to speak to decision makers, parliamentarians, the media, and I do that on my own modestly, but I realize that sometimes you need to educate people because they don't realize all the complexities of these issues, and that is a responsibility for all of us. IDN again plays this role, as you said. We just published this 20 lies against about nuclear weapons, that are how to respond to them, which we think will be useful for NGOs, for individual activists, precisely to be able to answer those assertions that our security relies on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, and they ensure that we have peace, which of course, as we know, is not true. So we have this collective work. We have also used some of the research by some of the speakers today, and so we want to maybe make that available and popular for the general public. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. Now we have received already a number of questions, and so I would like to start with the first two ones. Lorena Schlicht from Malakoff comes with the question: could addressing the root causes of conflict through human security, for example, by tackling poverty, inequality, and so on, reduce reliance on nuclear deterrence and promote sustainable global peace? And the second one, which I would take up here at the start, is from Jean Morris from Manchester. He refers to the fact that the nuclear deterrence is based on rational behavior. And as some irrational actors coming to power, he asks, what does this mean for nuclear deterrence? So the floor is open to all four of you.
Can I volunteer to say something on the second?
Yeah, sure. I'm grateful for this.
Okay, so on the rationality question, I just wanted to make two quick points. One, and that amplifies some of what Schulz has said. Deterrence theory looks more rational and consistent than it actually is. Because if you think about the expectations of rational deterrence theory for small nuclear arsenals, the expectation is if you're a small nuclear armed state, like you're France or you're the UK, the logic is you need to convince your adversary that you will retaliate even after being hit. And since the 1950s, we know that for France or for the UK, being hit would mean being destroyed. So literally, for very small nuclear armed states, retaliating is utterly irrational because your country has been destroyed already. But the expectation of the theory is that, of course, everyone would believe that you would. So deterrence theory is about circulating expectations of rationality at times and irrationality at other times. So this theory overall doesn't exclusively assume that everyone is rational. It's very inconsistent. It assumes that actors are rational at times and irrational at others. And the second point I wanted to make is, if your consideration is that we may have leaders who are willing to take the risk of nuclear retaliation, that's simply a reminder of what security based on nuclear threat making has been from the beginning. It's being at the mercy of accidental, inadvertent explosion, or anyone who's simply willing to take the risk of dying to kill us all. Because anyone who has enough nuclear weapons to cause large damage and who is willing to take that risk, then we're dead.
Yeah, perhaps I can just jump on there as well.
Yeah.
I agree with what Professor Pelopidas said, but I would just add that, depending on how you define rationality, or if we define rationality as most social scientists do, as essentially efficiency of pursuing your ends, your goals in the most efficient manner possible. Rationality doesn't say anything about the reasonableness of your goals or your ends. So you could easily be a rational actor and use nuclear weapons if you thought that was the most efficient way of fulfilling your goals, right? We could imagine that in the current conflict in Ukraine, for example. But I think most of the time when people use the word rationality in this context, they mean they rather mean reasonable or reason. And yeah, I agree. In most cases, it's you would hope that people would be reasonable when it comes to nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, with this technology, that's a problem because it's so centralized in the hands usually of one individual. In most of the nuclear armed states, it's down to one person really to make the decision about whether to use or not. In most cases, so that's something a lot of people find a bit scary, and is something that people are campaigning on in different countries. I just thought also I would very, very quickly address the human security question that you asked, Thomas. I think the straightforward answer is yes. Solving all the root causes of all the conflicts would be of great help for the cause of nuclear arms control and disarmament. And that's also what the current nuclear armed states say when they're pressed on these matters, right? Is that we need to solve the conflicts, the problems first, and then we can do arms control and disarmament. But you could also make the point, right, that arms control and disarmament in many cases could help bring about a more peaceful world. Nuclear weapons are not just nuclear weapons are also part of this problem, many would argue, right? So the way historians have defined the end of the Cold War, for example, is precisely the initiation of these major arms control agreements. So that was what brought about the end of the Cold War, was these disarmament agreements. So we often tend to mix up the explanandum and the explanans, or the dependent and independent variables, to use a very social sciencey language. That these two things often meld together. It's not always clear what's affecting what. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thomas,
Yeah.
can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I want to address a couple of points and probably move away from rationality. When I teach, especially the military, I actually don't go into rationality. Rationality to me is very cultural, localized, and what might seem rational to you might actually seem completely irrational to me. I think to me, the best way to assess a nuclear deterrence is really about risk tolerance, right? There are countries that are very risk tolerant, like Russia, like Pakistan, like North Korea. And those states might appear to us completely playing a brinkmanship game. But in their strategic culture, that risk tolerance is justified under a series of factors. So for me, I would claim that there is no irrational act in nuclear deterrence. There are risk tolerance and high risk tolerance acts. And when we think about risk, then we can actually manage it or somehow understand it a little bit better. But I also would like to push a little bit against this idea of nuclear accidents. Look, I teach the US Air Force. I work with Strategic Command, and I have never seen a nuclear enterprise more committed to actually not have accidents around nuclear weapons. There are thousands of people in the United States and in China, people that I work with pretty directly, who are really, really, really understanding what we are talking about here, right? And the simple idea that, look, this bunch of people around nuclear weapons don't know what they are doing. They're a bunch of amateurs, you know, accidents here, accident there, is just illusion. Most of the time when we talk about threats or crises, we go 50 years back. The new Cuban Missile Crisis was 50 years ago, right? 50 years afterwards, we have changed a lot of procedures precisely because of that crisis. I don't want to leave you with the understanding that nuclear enterprises just stay on, stalemating, looking and waiting for risk and accidents to happen. That's not the case. There are thousands of young people, cadets that I train every week that understand very well what these nuclear weapons do and what they shouldn't do. So let's try to have also respect for people who actually do believe in nuclear weapons and make it actually the more manageable possible. Now, does nuclear deterrence imply risks? Yes, the entire point is to create fear and to create terror and to manipulate risks. Of course, that is the game in town. But the belief that these people don't understand what is at stake here, I think is fundamentally misleading and leads, in my view, to the perception from their side that the nuclear disarmament activists just don't understand what it means to be a nuclear weapon state. So I would encourage you, especially for people who are interested in understanding nuclear disarmament, to engage a little bit more with the cadets that actually train day in and day out in silos in North Dakota at minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit and understand what it is to ensure security and safety of these nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. And of course, I think it's always good to think of the many military persons who are in the strategic forces, and it's quite interesting that after the retirement, quite a number of the most prominent ones become nuclear disarmament activists because they really know the issues. And I think, as you have said, we should respect those people because they also feel a lot of responsibility and make their own thoughts about these things. Yeah, we have now so many questions received, and the time is running. I just want to bring up.
Can I just say one word on this issue?
Sure.
Yeah. So just to clarify on the discussion with Francesca on accidents, the point is really not to be disrespectful of those people. No, the point is to say there is evidence of those people and institutions they belong to who have covered accidents and not learned from them for decades. Because actually learning from them would have required confessing failure. So even if we want to be optimistic and say sooner or later they learn, that means that there is a period of time in which we're in danger. Second, there is a literature in anthropology, mostly Hugh Gustafson, that shows how engineers and nuclear-related personnel essentially convince themselves of their own perfect control. So they become overconfident. And finally, as I said, the examples are old for reasons of nuclear secrecy. So the fact that the people you teach are very confident only tells us one thing: they're very confident. That doesn't push back against any argument that shows that those systems produce unforeseeable and unavoidable accidents.
Yeah, but you can't prove them, right? Because of secrecy. So, I mean, the same argument is the same everywhere. This idea is there are accidents, but you then tell us because of secrecy. And what these people are saying to you is, we understand that managing a nuclear weapon that allows zero failure, it's an extraordinarily challenging enterprise, right? And we have put together, as best as we could, a system that is trying to reduce those risks. It's also not true that they have not disclosed the errors. And I have followed many of them because some of my US Air Force fellows were involved in it. When there was the crisis about the depression among the US Air Force that were actually involved in managing silos in North Dakota, where they actually discovered that there were a series of problems of alcoholism and so on and so forth, the US Air Force has taken one of the most extensive reviews of safety and security protocols. Now, maybe you should talk about Russia and China, and not always the nuclear democracies that seem to be constantly on the target here, right? Maybe let's ask Russia how he manages his systems, and then we'll talk.
I mean, again,
okay, and I think we are having
Robert
quite a good
Purefoy,
debate
who
now.
was a safety engineer at Sandia National Lab, documented that his own institution censored him for 15 years. So maybe you're telling me that he lied.
Well, I think we could continue a discussion on this, but should we also give a chance to address some of the other questions that we have received? And the first one comes from Mike McCormick from Seattle. He underlines the problem that accidents might be interpreted by a foe as an attack and lead to a misguided response. And Jackie Cabasso asks, comes with a quote and then the question. U.S. Navy Admiral Charles Richards, then Chief of U.S. Strategic Command, wrote, "We must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear forces, as they create the maneuver space for us to project conventional military power strategically." Can the speakers elaborate on how nuclear deterrence enables devastating conventional wars? So then finally, I also want to come with a question from Yiran Wang concerning the need for an effective mechanism to protect victims of nuclear weapons tests and also raised more attention to it. I think these three questions will now be in the second round, and then if we still have time, I will try to bring additional questions. So whoever wants to take this up.
I'm happy to say something about the testing, given that I mentioned it. Yeah, so it's a really, I think, important question. And there is a history of the communities themselves having to advocate, having to develop the knowledge themselves because the states who are doing the testing didn't acknowledge this and haven't done the studies. So for example, the work that Benoit mentioned about his team about the Mururoa files and the testing in the French testing is really interesting to look into. The challenge to these communities has often been the lack of information that they have, because they don't have the scientific data that often they need to prove a health impact, because those studies have not been done, or because they are the sort of communities who historically haven't had the level of healthcare and level of information that would be necessary for them to prove their case. So there's been a real challenge historically for communities to be able to advocate and receive compensation and support as testing victims. And there are countries actually I mean, you know, as Francesca mentions, there's a variable lack of information on testing victims from different countries. So I mean, in terms of the victims of China's nuclear testing, we know very, very little about this. One vehicle that has come up in recent years is the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has measures in it that specifically address the victims of nuclear testing, and has developed an international mechanism in order to help redress this. Although this, again, doesn't really... I mean, this engages with the harms of testing at the moment and nuclear explosions, and not necessarily with the harms of nuclear production. But I think that if you were interested in this, the TPNW is one place to go to, but also the communities themselves, downwinder communities around the world, have been incredibly active in creating knowledge and doing research on their communities and in advocating for themselves. And I think that amplifying those voices is an incredibly important thing to do, and a really, I think, valuable and useful thing to do is to find those communities and to share their stories, and to kind of amplify their voices.
Thank you.
Thomas, can I address the conventional nuclear?
Of course, I would invite you to do this. Yeah.
I think this is a really important question, to be honest. And this is where you see the limitations of nuclear deterrence, right? So China has a really interesting definition. This goes back to the time of Mao, when Mao defined nuclear and conventional as follows: nuclear shield and conventional sword. And so the overall idea, which exists, I think, in China and in the United States for sure, is the belief that, look, provided that you basically secure the system at the strategic level, right? That you fundamentally, through nuclear weapons, you prevent a major escalation between these two great powers, then this allows instability at the lower levels, right? And that's why nuclear deterrence is not a mechanism for peace, and arguably is not even a mechanism for stability itself, right? So it's simply the absence of this large-scale war that we consider to be so catastrophic, like Laura was mentioning, right? So that allows countries, in a way, paradoxically, to feel a little bit more emboldened, which I believe, we've talked about in this panel, to actually take more aggressive, more assertive behaviors at the conventional level. This is one of the concerns, for example, the United States has vis-a-vis China in the Indo-Pacific. The more China builds up and is secure in its nuclear arsenal, and the more China can actually take aggressive behavior or postures at the conventional level. Now, this is true also for the United States, quite frankly, and all nuclear weapon states that feel that they have a shield around them, nuclear weapons, that allow them then to engage much more aggressively at the conventional level. But I want to make one point, because actually was mentioned before on nuclear weapons fighting non-nuclear weapon states. Don't make the mistake. Nuclear weapon states have lost plenty of wars against non-nuclear weapon states. The Soviets have lost in Afghanistan. The United States arguably lost in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it's not, the point is really not, so these losses don't necessarily undermine the principle of nuclear deterrence, right? So you have countries that simply, for various reasons, decide to fight wars, and they don't consider that ultimate gift or price to pay, like reasonable enough to use nuclear weapons. I think Russia and Ukraine is a different kind of game altogether, because of the existential and the identity related crisis that this is. But so nuclear deterrence doesn't always play around when you have nuclear weapon states involved in conflicts. I think that is also the mistake, that we tend often to somehow believe nuclear deterrence plays at any game, which is actually not true. Nuclear weapons have a very limited scope and very limited role. In fact, almost a minimum one. Let me also mention one other point. I think somebody else mentioned this idea of accidents that could lead to misguided interpretations. I think the overall idea, I think, is very true, that we don't actually know how accidents could lead or potentially lead to misinterpretations. We have started mapping out escalation pathways, And so, for example, the Trump administration, you're probably going to see it in the Trump 2.0, introduced this idea that if critical infrastructures of the United States were coming under attack by cyber attacks, the United States could respond with nuclear weapons. This is an overstretching of the nuclear deterrence posture, which is quite concerning, to be honest, right? So states now try to do with nuclear weapons way more than what the nuclear weapons that were designed for in the first place, to be somehow, or in the first phase of the deterrence theory. So yes, I could see ways in which a country that comes under a catastrophic accident internally might justify this by saying, I've been attacked, or there was a sabotage on my military bases, and therefore I need to retaliate. I think that to me it's reasonable. But we don't exactly know, and I think this is where accidents are important. We don't exactly know how other countries will react. And let me just mention one last point. There was a very interesting attempt in 2023 by the US Congress to say to Russia, if you somehow fake an accident at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, and there is going to be an environmental effect, radiation spreads on the NATO territory, the US Congress might consider it an act of war against NATO. Problem is, it didn't pass. It was obviously too somehow challenging to pass. But it was a first attempt to lead this idea of fake accidents or sabotage with the potential escalation into conflict.
Thank you, Francesca. So we really have to come to an end, and I would like now to take just two questions. I know there are more that came in. One is from Sabine Meschkat-Peters from Hanover. She asks whether so-called mini nukes, tactical nuclear weapons, would lower the threshold of nuclear deterrence. And Lydia Merrill, she came with a number of interesting questions. And one that I would like to address here is, how can mayors help to promote the TPNW and put pressure on policy makers? And this question, I think I can answer immediately. Well, that's the whole idea about mayors for peace, to promote nuclear disarmament. The main objective of mayors for peace in the current work program is to promote the TPNW. And together with ICANN, mayors for peace, they work very closely hand in hand also to make more and more cities sign up to the ICANN city appeal. So these things are, of course, at the core of the work of both organizations. And perhaps you want to use now your last interventions for addressing the question concerning mini nukes. And if there's anything else you want to say in 2 minutes each, it is fine. So should we start with Laura?
I'm going to leave the question of mini nukes to the other panelists who I think are far more qualified than me. And I will just say, yeah, it's been really great to be a part of this, and thank you very much, and thank you for the questions.
Francesca, thank you, Laura.
Yes, yes. So low yield nuclear weapons, do they lower the threshold of nuclear weapons use? Yes, that's why they are introduced. And that is my point to the TPNW crowd and the ICANN crowd. Guys, I understand nuclear disarmament is important, but the opposite to nuclear disarmament is not nuclear deterrence, is nuclear warfighting. And if you think that the school of thought has disappeared in the United States or in Russia or in any other country, I would urge you to rethink that. The issue here is not only, and I put myself in a sort of more existential nuclear deterrence crowd, which is really way more like, an existential more than anything belief, that we are now squeezed in between the nuclear disarmament campaign and a bunch of people that are very reasonable, and they are telling you today, well, if nuclear deterrence doesn't work, then maybe we should conventionalize nuclear weapons. The attempt of introducing low yield is a very clear attempt to say to people, the use of nuclear weapons is not a big deal, right? Does not necessarily lead to a massive catastrophic destruction of the planet. That's why we have also introduced a difference in language between a nuclear weapon use and a nuclear strike. A nuclear strike is large strategic weapons, but a nuclear weapon use, what will be the problem? The worst part that can happen to nuclear disarmament and nuclear deterrence, if one of these low yield nuclear weapons goes off and the world says, well, that's not a big deal after all. We have seen worse. So low yield creates massive problems for nuclear disarmament and for nuclear deterrence as a whole, because they introduce a new idea that you can fight limited nuclear wars without destroying the planet, without having gigantic radiations, fallouts. And after all, 48 hours later, we will all go back and be friends again. If that comes to pass, we will enter into a world where nuclear disarmament and nuclear deterrence will have a very, very hard time. And the last point is this. Low yield are also different, I say often to my students. They are very different from tactical nuclear weapons. The tactical nuclear weapons were supposed to be used in a battlefield, right? So you already had a crisis, a conventional, exchange, and you were somehow, lowering to the use of nuclear weapons. Low yield nuclear weapons are more subtle because a country can always say, but this is just defensive, right? I transport it with me. I don't intend to use it, but if the situation calls for it, here I am. And introduce a level of uncertainty in the other mind, right? That somehow then puts pressure on new arms race, new technologies to detect these weapons. So it creates a completely different strategic environment. And they are coming. They are coming in the Asia Pacific, and they will be deployed.
I think we have lost now the voice of Francesca, but I think it's quite clear she's warning us concerning the danger to introduce mini nukes. Benoit, can you hear me?
Yes. I'm just noting that Schulz had his hand up, so I'll go after. Schulz should go first.
You go last, then Schulz first.
Okay, yeah,
Schulz,
thanks.
yes,
Thanks on the mini nukes. I suppose. Well, I'm not totally sure what the question had in mind. There's a distinction on the one hand between tactical and strategic, which mainly applies to the range of the weapon system, and then between low yield or smaller yield, I suppose, and high yield nuclear weapons. In both instances, though, there's been more talk, at least in Western countries, or especially in the United States recently, of adding more tactical or low yield options. Could that reduce or lower the bar for nuclear use? Yes, I think it absolutely could. But, and I'm going to be difficult here, it also could do the opposite. That's at least the argument of the people who are in favor of this. They argue precisely that you need these options in order to produce a robust deterrent effect that allows you not to use the nuclear weapons in the first place. So these people argue that it's in almost all cases, it's just simply not credible to threaten to use a huge strategic nuclear weapon because the effect will be so enormous. So it's generally not credible to threaten to do that. And adversaries might exploit this credibility deficit with a small yield nuclear weapon use of their own. This is the theory. And so the thinking goes that you need to plug this gap by having options on the whole escalation ladder, so-called, so that you have escalation dominance and that you don't have to use nuclear weapons in the first place. And nuclear deterrence is strengthened. The bar for using nuclear weapons is actually rendered higher. That's the theory. Now, both of those theories that I laid out, it reduces the risk or it increases the risk. They're both largely unfalsifiable, and we should be very happy that they are, of course, because we don't want anyone to be using nuclear weapons. So, of course, next to those two theories, you have the obvious option, which is the only safe. What's the saying again? The only winning move is not to play. You know, that's the alternative option. That, of course, is the option that the vast majority of the world's states have decided to take. And we should, I think, never forget that perspective. In conversations like this, we often kind of convince ourselves that nuclear weapons are, that every country has nuclear weapons and is totally committed to them. But the reality is, of course, that most countries don't have nuclear weapons and don't see them as particularly useful for their security needs. So I'll stop there and leave it to Benoit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you for giving me like extra 2 minutes to try to say something meaningful. Yeah, I'll say three things. One is just a suggestion, you know, whether or not you think the end goal is global nuclear disarmament. And in times like now, you might feel, okay, like we're never going to get there. And then the assumption of that, the consequence of that is that then the existing situation becomes acceptable. So always avoid the dichotomy of now versus your ideal world, whatever this ideal world is. Always think about what would be the intermediary world that is a little better than the one now that we should aim for. And so here, and I think this is something, I'd be curious, maybe Francesca would agree with that. One of the findings that is established long before us is that if you look at only the United States and the Soviet Union, the size of the arsenals over time have always exceeded the requirements of nuclear deterrence according to their own military. So they always had additional missions on top of the deterrence mission. And so one, you know, let's say progress would be to go back to a world where, I mean, Bruce Blair would call it a deterrence-only world. And that would be a line to push against the warfighters, to just say, like, look, given what you say you're doing, you have no good reason not to want to at least go to that point. Because going to a deterrence-only world already gives us a substantive margin for change. And the third and final point, I'll go back to the start, is to say that there's so much, secrecy and uncertainty on those matters. It's crucial to always ask the question, who's funding this research? What are the ideological biases behind it? And to rely on clear evidence based on the absence of conflicts of interest. And on this, I just want to say, if you have any additional questions to me or to the team, we're here for you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a very good final word, because I hope you all found this engaged discussion as interesting as I did. And of course, that's not the end. For many of us, it's rather a beginning to get deeper into this, well, crucial life-saving or threatening issues. And so here you have an offer to follow up. I hope you all found this helpful, this discussion. I want to thank our excellent panelists. It was really great to have you all four here. And I want also to express my gratitude, because you were the ones we wanted to have, and everybody sent a mail. Yes, of course, I'll do it. It was very kind of you. And the conclusion now comes from the president of the European chapter of Mayors for Peace, Mayor Alba Banosel from Granollers. And then I wish you a good evening, rest of the day, and please stay focused on this crucial issue, nuclear weapons, and how could we get to a more peaceful world. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As a president of the European chapter of Mayor for Peace and Mayor of Granollers, I would like to thank you all of you, the excellent panelists, and also the organizers of this webinar, and all of you that are attending this webinar. I will read after with attention today's report, and I will be sure that there will be very interesting conclusions. I would like to reaffirm the European chapter's commitment to continue working for the peace and nuclear disarmament, a debt that we have with the demands of our citizens and especially with the people affected by nuclear weapons. As a reflection, I would like to mention the need to make change in the world's governance. We are here for that also. The world is not the same now that 75 years ago when the United Nations were founded. Therefore, we need new instruments, new forms for more inclusive and democratic governance in all the world, in the line called by the United Nations General Secretary. From local governments, from cities, we are ready to contribute to this aim, to these changes. I thank you, all of you, for participating in this webinar and for trying to build a better world. We will do it together.
Goodbye to all of you, and thank you again.